The moment that made you a star of Russian propaganda.
First of all, there were sandwiches, let's just be clear.
So you started feeding the Soviet army.
I was feeding the Soviet army. Somehow Putin's forgotten about that.
The conspiracy organized by the Americans.
You know, drunk Russian men.
That sounds very extreme.
We're not going to do some kind of 19th century great power chess negotiation. This is another Russian myth. We probably underestimated what his true sense of direction for the country was.
We all did.
Thank you, I feel better.
Thank you for joining me, and let me start with a very distant past. Tell me your story of how you spent a summer in a summer camp next to Odessa. Was it your first visit of Soviet Union or not?
It was. Well, first, Misha, it's great to be with you and great to get a chance to sit and talk to you. So I became fascinated with Russia and the Soviet Union at a very young age. I saw a Chekhov play when I was 12, and then I started reading Chekhov, and then I read all the Dostoevsky and all the Tolstoy. And by the time I got to university, I couldn't figure out why such a beautiful, rich, soulful culture and country had historically been so badly led. And so I became interested in Soviet and Russian politics and did that in addition to international relations at university. And then, of course, I wanted to go see it. I was studying Russian, but we had no money in the family to do one of these fancy programs.
But your family was not Russian speaking, right?
No, in fact, my roots are in Belarus and modern-day Moldova, and my people came to the United States in 1910, escaping the Tsar's army, pogroms and the Tsar's army, not wanting to be force-pressed into service. And they never spoke Russian, they spoke Yiddish. They were, Jews of the Pale of Settlement. Sure. So, and I'm named for my grandmother, who was born in Pinsk, or outside of Pinsk. So, that wasn't the root of it, because, my family didn't really have much Russian cultural roots, more Yiddish roots and Jewish roots. Anyway, but I became fascinated with the literature, with the culture, etc. So when I was in university, I wanted to go. And, there are these fancy programs you could pay a lot of money and study in then Leningrad or whatever, but we didn't have the means to do that. So the YMCA had an exchange program where they brought American young people, 20-year-olds, to various Red Guard summer camps, and so that was a way to go for free. I just had to pay the airfare, which I did from money I had saved up from taking care of people's kids and cleaning people's houses and all of that stuff. And that was a 2-week program. And, interestingly, when you think about my follow-on history, the first place I land in the Soviet Union is in Odessa, and we were at this place called Молодая Гвардия on the Black Sea coast, and the kids were 8 to 12 years old, and we taught American square dancing and songs, and we played with the kids and did a little bit of English, and we swam in the Black Sea, which in those days was not super clean, but it was really a fun time. But then, because I had spent the last of my savings to get there, and it was only 2 weeks, when we got to Moscow, I wanted to stay, but I needed a job, I needed a visa extension, and I interviewed with an American family at the embassy, and they hired me as a nanny for the rest of the summer. But I had this incredible, scary episode, because remember, it's Soviet Union, right? You don't know what's going to happen if you're out of visa status.
Which year was it?
This is 1982, right? So
Brezhnev is still alive.
Yeah. So the American family was going to hire me. Rest of my camp counselors were going home. They put me up in the Hotel Ukraina, the old one, before it was remonted, right? And I'm sitting there waiting to see if the Soviet authorities will give me a visa extension on Monday of the following week. But meanwhile, I'm sitting in this hotel all alone. They tell me I can't go outside with no visa. And I had lied to my parents about what was going on. But luckily, I was able to stay for the summer, and that summer was amazing. I lived in Moscow. I took care of some American kids, but we traveled all over the place. I got to go to Leningrad and also to other places, and really continued my passion and discovered exactly what I expected, which is that the Russian people, Ukrainian people are just amazing with this wonderful depth of soul. But unfortunately lived in this system that didn't really give them their best options. So,
were you shocked by something you have seen?
I guess I knew it was going to happen, but I was quite surprised by how aggressive the surveillance of us was in 1982. I mean, I was 20, I was nobody, and every time we went anywhere, there were people on us. Maybe it's because I worked for an embassy family, but that was sort of my first experience with that. Yeah.
And then you came back to the Soviet Union to work as an interpreter on the fishing boat, on the ship.
So that's a different story.
Is that true? And what was it the next trip to the Soviet Union, or there were some others?
So I finished university in 1983. I went to work for a U.S. member of Congress from California. In 1983, it's high Reagan in the U.S., so there's almost no U.S. companies operating in the Soviet Union. The only way to be involved in U.S.-Soviet relations at that time was mostly to work for the government. So I had applied to the State Department. I had done other government applications. I was working for this congressman. But friends of mine who were also Russian studies majors knew of this joint venture, which was on the U.S. side based in Seattle, Washington. On the Soviet side, it was based in Nakhodka. Where the Soviets would send these big factory fishing boats to the west coast of the United States to fish in our waters, but they weren't allowed to fish within 20 miles. But that's where they wanted to fish because that's where this fish called hake that the Soviets then fed to the army, disgusting, oily fish.
Yeah. It was the most popular fish or maybe the only fish in Soviet supermarkets.
Exactly. So I didn't actually go to the Soviet Union at that time. I talked to my congressman. I said, look, I have an opportunity to go on these fishing boats. I'll be gone for 8 months. I'll come back in the fall and I'll help you with your re-election campaign in California if you let me have this time off. So he said, great. So I flew out to Seattle, I trained, and I lived on this Soviet fish factory boat called the Aragonit, which was based in Nakhodka with 80 Russian men and 5 Russian women. The women were the cooks, and the doctor was also a woman, for 8 months. And the way the thing worked, the Soviets were not allowed to fish within our 20-mile zone. So the Americans would put small fishermen out in the water. They would actually catch the hake in big bags. And my job was to stand on the back deck and help the bag of fish be transferred from the American boat to the Soviet boat. And it would come up on the back deck. And then I would go down there with the factory manager, and we would negotiate how much fish was in that bag. So on a good day, I would say it's 12 tons. He would say it's 10 tons. On a good day, I would get 11 and a half. And on a bad day, I'd get 10 and a half. This is my first negotiating experience with Soviet. And depending upon what we agreed on, that fish would then be manufactured into fish cakes for the Soviet army, believe it or not. And my Americans would get paid.
So you started feeding the Soviet army.
I was feeding the Soviet army, but I was also...
Before you started famously feeding Ukrainian protesters with cookies, you started feeding Soviet army with fish.
Somehow Putin's forgotten about that. I was also feeding a bunch of West Coast American fishermen who needed the work, but it was lots of fun. And if I didn't get a good price in my negotiations, my Americans would yell at me on the radio at night, and if I did get a good price, then it was okay. So that was amazing. And, of course, there were lots of fabulous young people on that boat. The guys from Nakhodka taught me all my stars, all my fish And I could, of course, curse very nicely in Russian by the time I got off that boat. I learned to drink. There wasn't alcohol very often on the boat, but when there was, it was a party. And I, could have to stagger back to my cabin and put a chair under the lock because, drunk Russian men.
That sounds very extreme.
It was fun. It was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I got back on land and I collected, this much snail mail that had been waiting for me for 8 months, and buried in the middle there was an invitation from the State Department to join the diplomatic service. So I called my congressman and said, hey, how about if I don't come back? And he said, okay.
And so did you expect that time that the Soviet Union could collapse? Was it somewhere in your imagination?
In my mind, yeah. In university, I had written my senior paper, we all do a big thesis, on solidarity in Poland. And so I had really studied that popular movement for change and how it happens and the grievances that spark it and how people come together. So I didn't think it was impossible. And obviously there was a lot of restiveness already, not only in Eastern Europe, in the Baltics, etc. at that time. So I thought it was possible that people could want change for sure. Yeah. And I was certainly, when I first got into the diplomatic service, it was perestroika time. So I was interested in that Gorbachev experiment of opening the economy, etc. And mostly I just thought from a very young age that Americans and Russian people were not that dissimilar. We are big sky countries. We are very passionate people, and that if we ever worked together on this planet instead of working against each other, that it would be powerful. So I was interested in that from a young age.
In the early 90s, you worked with Strop Tablet, who was that time the most trusted and the most famous specialist on Soviet Union and Russia. Do you think that the way how the United States handled the process of collapse of Soviet Union, the policy towards Russia and other post-Soviet republics, how do you estimate that process? Was everything done in the right way?
Oh, everybody made mistakes. Russians made mistakes. Americans made mistakes. Everybody made mistakes. But one of the things was, I think that, we had been, by the time Russia starts to move, we had been working with Eastern European countries, with Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, etc., for some time. Those were smaller countries. They were countries that had a more recent experience of representative government. I mean, Russia had never really had representative government. And so in a certain way, the task of reopening the economy, reintegrating into Europe, was a muscle memory that they could awaken. Whereas we underestimated in Russia how big a task it was going to be. Everything from how vast the economy was to what state control meant in terms of corruption and lacks of check and balances and all these kinds of things. The lack of real understanding of civic participation. And, there were a lot of people, as you know, in Russia who very quickly took advantage, the first oligarchic classes. I think we didn't quite understand what it meant when you moved from the government owning everything to a handful of rich people owning everything. And as you and I talked about a minute ago, a country that is changing that fast needs a strong sense of who it is as a nation. And somehow that got a little bit lost, this proud sense of Russian nationhood and how you have a democratic and European Russia rather than a Soviet Union, I think was not well articulated by Russian leaders at that point. They were just eager to be like Europe, whereas they didn't connect those ideas well enough to Russian history, to Russian potential, all of those kinds of things. And we, We tried to be extremely generous. As you know, there was almost $100 billion in support of various kinds that came from us and other Europeans, including, I remember, first negotiations in the IMF to support the ruble, et cetera. But I think, a lot of those things that were done to open the economy so fast didn't allow the population to adjust. So many people, as you know, lost their own social safety net and suffered, whereas a few people got very, very rich. And neither the Russian government nor we appreciated the backlash that was going to come as a result of that.
A lot of people would actually disagree. I mean, I've spoken to many former ministers of the first Russian government, reformist government.
Because you're having company.
Reformist government, and they love talking about the absence of any Marshall Plan for Russia. And they say that Gaidar's government was waiting for some kind of real help from the United States. And they hoped that Russian economy should have been supported. And they say that there was no Marshall Plan, there was not enough substantial help from the West. Do you agree?
It's objectively untrue. If you look at how much the IMF and the World Bank and we as nations were giving.
Even Soviet debts were not forgiven for Russia.
They were largely forgiven. Lend-Lease wasn't forgiven, but Lend-Lease was forgotten about. But mostly, Russia was able to completely reschedule its debt, and a huge amount of it was forgiven, not private debt that had to be negotiated. But if you look at the figures, as I said, between 1991 and 1996, more than $100 billion in foreign assistance went into Russia, mostly through the IMF and the World Bank, because we wanted the management systems that came with that. I think where things began to get out of whack was when the state enterprises started getting sold off very quickly, and some people got very rich. And then when the ruble got into trouble in '98, could we have done more then? Should we have? It happened very quickly, as you know. But I also think that the vastness of Russia, probably things should have moved more slowly on both sides, if that makes sense. I don't know what you think about that. Were you even born then?
I think that obviously the beginning of '90s was the terrible missed opportunity.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to shape that scenario retroactively. Yeah. What should have been done, but obviously a lot of mistakes. And I'm not here to criticize Americans. I'm trying to focus on our mistakes, on the mistakes of Russian government, former Russian government, of Russian elites, Russian intellectuals, Russian businessmen, and I think a lot was like. I don't know if you follow closely the debate on that topic in Russian society. That is still happening after Marie Pevchik's documentary. Have you heard of it? Have you seen it? It's called Traitors, and that's the very powerful documentary. It's not an investigation. It's much more of political stance, denouncing Yeltsin's administration, Yeltsin's government, and oligarchs, specifically for loans for shares auctions and the election campaign of '96. Because she says in that documentary, and before that, I wrote a book about that period, and it's clear that the idea of the democracy was betrayed by people who called themselves Democrats. Because they instead of becoming founding fathers of Russian democracy, they cared too much about their own personal position, about their power, and any kind of faith in the democratic institutions was lost.
Well, certainly loans for shares was a catastrophe in terms of its goal, which was to redistribute and give opportunity and create a middle class and all of that. And should we have asked more questions? Should we have pushed the Russian government then for more, checks and balances on that system? Maybe, since we were supporting it. But again, as I said, this same strategy had been used in smaller countries like Poland, like the Czech Republic, and it had worked relatively well in terms of creating a middle class and giving people a stake as the country privatized. And in Russia, as you say, a few people got very rich and a lot of people didn't. In the Yeltsin campaign of 96, it's not too dissimilar to what you see in other democracies in the sense that there weren't good options, right? It was Yeltsin on the one hand or Zelensky on the other hand. But I think what's equally interesting, Misha, if I may, is what happened when Putin comes to power. Those first 5-10 years of Putinism, whether you count it from when he was prime minister or from when he becomes president, where he starts systematically ripping up the foundations of an open system, right? He goes after the press, TV first, and then the newspapers, and then radio. He doesn't allow those business people who had gotten rich to participate in politics. This is when he goes after Khodorkovsky and Gusinski, et cetera, because they dared to challenge in the parliament his idea of reestablishing state control. And the security state reemerges, and he starts reconsidering a lot of cooperation programs. I remember serving in the Bush 41 administration with people who I respected a lot, who said, it's not America's business what's happening inside Russia. It only matters to us how we are cooperating on the international stage, and that they, have brought their army home from Eastern Europe, that we're working on issues like Iran together, these kinds of things, that they're no longer pressuring their neighbors. But I think it did matter in terms of Russia's future, what was happening inside, that the shoots of democracy and of openness and pluralism and free press and free speech were babies. They were 10 years old in Russia or less. And he was able, within 5 years, to roll so much of that back and to establish that state control system, which allowed him to block out any voices who wanted that democratic Russia, and that just got worse and worse. And had we raised more questions then, had we made our cooperation more conditional on Russia being a real democracy, staying a real democracy, might it have ended up differently for Russians? I don't know.
It's a very interesting approach that you mentioned from the Bush administration. I've heard several times from different Russian officials that they have some kind of theory that the real, or at least in the foreign policy, the real two-party system in America is the party of Kissinger and party of Brzezinski. And there are two very different approaches to the foreign policy and specifically to Russia. And they have always preferred dealing with Republicans, Kissinger party, because they are pragmatic, they do not pretend to be saints, they do not lecture us on the human rights, and so it's easier to deal with that approach. And it's much harder with Brzezinski's party, because they according to Russian officials, that's very hypocritical approach, and they are always trying to impose some kind of values. Russian officials obviously believe that Americans do not believe in those values, although they're trying to impose those values on Russians. Is there some part of, is it in any way correct that there are such two schools, two ideologies in American foreign policy?
It's too simplistic, for sure. There are plenty of Republicans, including many that I've worked for, who are freedom Republicans and who believe that it matters to us how the countries that we work with are governed. And there are plenty of Democrats who are just transactional. So I think it's too simplistic to ascribe it to the two parties. I do think, though, that when the United States works with countries around the world, there's a difference in the way you can work with fellow democracies, the way you can work with countries that are open, countries where the people regularly get a real choice at the ballot box, not a fake choice, where the press plays the role of keeping politicians and the system honest, where business is truly free and open and competitive. Those kinds of countries are easier for us to ally with. We can expect that those checks and balances in the system are going to ensure that when we work together, they're going to stay generally in favor of protecting the same things internationally, right? An open trade system, an open political system, equal rights for all human beings, regardless of where they are and regardless of their color or nationality or religion or any of those things. And countries that go autocratic, and the president's talking about this even today, then it's up to the mercurial views of one leader or one group of leaders what the interests of that state are.
For some countries, it's okay.
For some countries, it's okay?
Yeah.
What countries would you give that to?
I'm speaking not about myself, but about the American approach. But it seems like the authoritarian system in Saudi Arabia is not a problem.
Look, I think for many of us, it does cause questions, and it's going to, and it has historically limited what we have been able to do together. I mean, Saudi Arabia is not being invited to join NATO. We are talking about security arrangements now, but they're the kinds of security arrangements that Saudi Arabia has wanted for 30 years that we haven't been willing to give them. So I think there are limits. You know, we are not going to send our young men and women to fight to defend a country that is ruled by a small group of leaders, probably, unless that, you know, and that's historically been a choice that we make. Because you can't be, if the decisions of a country are not in the hands of its people, if the leader is afraid of his or her, usually it's a him, own people, then you're not going to have that support for openness and freedom abroad that has kept us safe and that is the root of the alliances that we have, be the national objective. And you can see it now. You know, we thought, as you know, in the 90s, even in the odd years, that if we locked Russia into the system, let them into the World Trade Organization, created the G8, same with China, right? That countries would open, that they would see benefit from the open system that we favor, and that it would have an implication for their people, and their people would have more of a voice, too, in protecting that system. But it went the other way, right? You had a backlash in Putin, and you had a backlash in Xi Jinping.
Yeah, I wanted to ask one more question about Yeltsin's period, but it's important. Russia was not invited to WTO until very late. Mm-hmm. It was knocking on the door for decades, and only in late Putin's years it finally happened. And in the beginning, we don't know if Putin was pretending, but he was talking to Bill Clinton, to Lord George Robertson, General Secretary of NATO. He was proposing, asking for the invitation to NATO. He sounded as he was in favor of Russia joining NATO. Was it an option? Was it a missed possibility, or you don't believe it?
First, on the WTO piece, I think one of the things that loans for shares taught all of us in the international system and the ruble crash of '98 was that it was going to take quite a bit of time for Russia to implement the kind of economic safety net and undercarriage to be a country that could live up to its WTO obligations. And there there always are a lot of concrete hoops to go through before you can get into the WTO, and it took Putin quite a while to get there. I mean, just floating the currency was a requirement, as you know, and the Chinese did that faster than Russia, et cetera. So I would argue that what happened there was that we were a little bit burned by what happened in the late 90s and wanted to make sure that all of the standards of the organization were met. With regard to NATO, my memory of this, I remember several conversations with Yeltsin in his second term about whether Russia should get on a path to joining NATO, because, as you know, all of the neighbors by that time were either in NATO or on the way. And our attitude was, if you're prepared to be that kind of country, a solid democracy with real elections, real free press, real openness, real transparent budgets, real opportunity for free trade, why not? It will be a different Russia, but it would also create a cementing of the relationship between Europe and Russia. And in fact, that's why we initially created in 97 the Permanent Joint Council between Russia and NATO, and then later in the Bush administration where we created the NATO-Russia Council. And I really thought in those days that well before Russia was fully admitted, if she wanted to be, that most of the business of NATO would move to the NATO-Russia Council. Because there were a lot of things that we could have been doing together, for example, missile defense vis-a-vis Iran, et cetera. But I think it was Putin's ultimate suspicion. He thought Russia was too big to be in this family. He didn't want to be constrained. He didn't want truly to meet the democratic standards, as we know, because he was taking Russia in the wrong direction. I don't remember a conversation with Putin and our leaders about joining NATO. I think he thought he had a different concept of Russia, that it was, he didn't want to be like Germany. He wanted to be a counterweight to NATO, and that's what we see.
And going slightly to the beginning of the 90s and the process of the enlargement of NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there is a mythical agreement between James Baker and Foreign Minister Shevardnadze. And a lot of Russian authors write about it, that yes, there was nothing signed on paper, but verbally there was a mutual agreement that after the collapse of after the end of the Soviet Union, NATO doesn't go further to the east. And according to that mythical idea, which is very popular in Russia, that promise was broken by the Clinton administration. Was there any kind of dilemma in Clinton era to go east, to enlarge NATO or not?
First of all, I would note that Baker, who supposedly made this deal, categorically denies that he ever said it, as does George H.W. Bush. Mm-hmm. He says that it never happened and that there was never such a conversation. Mm-hmm. So that's a question mark. Look, I mean, I think the problem is, and it's a particular problem as Putin and Putinism have deepened and lasted so long, is this enemy image of NATO. NATO is a defensive alliance. It doesn't attack you unless you attack it first. So the idea of the Permanent Joint Council between Russia and NATO and then the NATO-Russia Council was that if we are not enemies, if we are not attacking each other, we can use these structures to advance our shared security interests together. And that was the goal. And so as NATO gets bigger, it's not getting bigger to attack Russia, it's getting bigger to ensure that if there is a reversal in Russia, which we now see, that those countries are protected, but also that we as a democratic family can act together in other parts of the world. as we later did in Afghanistan, as we later did in training in Iraq, because we understand each other. Had Russia been willing to be that kind of partner, had Russia been interested in being a NATO member, I think history would have been different. But it would have had to have maintained and strengthened and deepened the original idea of a democratic system. It would have had to have gone in the direction that Poland and Lithuania and Latvia went, of real elections and real political parties and real free and open press, and the security services being in their box, and judiciaries providing humans a real chance, and human rights for everybody. But that's not what Putin wanted.
In the beginning of Putin's first presidential term, in the beginning of Bush administration, there was some kind of illusion that two presidents were very constructive with each other, and the relationships were more or less doing well. And then something went wrong, and something was obviously broken. Do you see what was the turning point?
I think there were a bunch of things that happened in those early years on both sides. First of all, an early decision of the Bush administration to abandon the ABM treaty, even though they'd talked about it in the campaign, we should have taken the time to try to explain our position to the Russian side more, and to see if we could work through revisions. And instead, we moved very quickly, so that was something that the Russian military was concerned about, because they were afraid that they would end up behind. So that's one thing. Second, after September 11th, which, as you remember, is in the first year of the Bush 43 administration, we reached out to Russia on counterterrorism. And I think both Putin and Bush felt that we would really be able to consolidate our information, consolidate our strength to deal with the Taliban, to deal with Al-Qaeda, all of this kind of stuff. And I think there was разочарование on both sides, if you can say. We felt that the Russian side did not really share much useful intelligence, even though it had been very deep in Afghanistan for a long time, and certainly no targeting. And we felt like there were forces that were inside the Russian and former Soviet security system that were happy to see us suffer the way Russia had suffered. I think on Putin's side, he somehow felt that all of our intentions and plans in terms of the way we were going to go after Al-Qaeda should be open to the Russian side, even as Russia was denying us overflight and other things that we needed to go after.
He was obviously disappointed. I can tell you with the military base with the air base in Kyrgyzstan,
right.
Manas, because
right.
he thought that that was a very nice gesture from the Russian side to share the base with Americans, and after all, he found that Americans were not going to leave, although he was expecting that after several years, Americans would leave. And he was really disappointed by.
Well, I would remind him that Kyrgyzstan was not his country, and the Kyrgyz had invited us to stay. But here is the fundamental problem with the obraz myshlenia, right? Which is that he thinks he owns all these countries, and that together the U.S. and Russia can decide, like chess pieces, what's going to happen with them. And that's not the way we approach things. An independent country gets to make its own decisions regardless of what Russia wants. And if Kyrgyzstan's going to invite us to continue to stay there, we're going to stay there. If Ukraine wants our support with their democratic movement, we're going to support them. We're not going to do some kind of 19th century great power chess negotiation about how all these little guys get to live. That's the difference between autocracies and democracies, and it was evident from the beginning. The last piece I would say with regard to where things went wrong in the early Putin years was, again, we watched Putin systematically dismantle the very, very young democratic system in Russia. So when you see the free press go down, when you see business folks like Khodorkovsky-Gusinski, who are trying to become political actors, squished and attacked using the judiciary, when you see human rights organizations threatened, when you see, in fact, the direct franchise right, he starts to roll back the way that original Yeltsin constitution elected local officials, et cetera, and he starts trying to have more control in the regions. Then there's a question. Is this a Russia that's on a more open European democratic trajectory, or is it consolidating power? And therefore, we're going to have a question about how much we can do together.
You didn't mention Ukraine, although I think that the Orange Revolution was the beginning of new Putin and his new approach to Americans, because he started thinking that it was the conspiracy organized by the Americans, and he according to his mindset, Orange Revolution was the part of the operation to topple him.
But it's so crazy. This was about what was happening inside Ukraine. There was no external element to what was happening in Ukraine, unless you are scared of your own people and you think that they might catch the democratic contagion and want more democratic governance, not less, which is what you are offering them. So the fact that Putin is threatened by what's happening in Ukraine just tells you that even then he thought, Ukraine, это наш. They're not an independent country, right? And that is not a Russian leader who is moving in a more democratic direction. That's a Russian leader who is leading in a more autocratic direction. So it's obviously going to limit what we can do together. And we probably underestimated what his true sense of direction for the country was.
We all did.
Yeah.
Thank
you. I feel better.
Why didn't the United States insist in 2008 during the NATO summit in Bucharest on Ukraine and Georgia getting membership action plan? And why didn't you insist on getting Ukraine in? And was there any possibility? Tell me about that historic summit and Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy opposing that plan, George Bush insisting, and very weird compromise as a result.
Very weird compromise. I agree with that. Going into that NATO summit, and I was there, I was U.S. ambassador to NATO then, the Georgians were very clear. They wanted NATO. All sides then in the Georgian political process, except the extremes, wanted to be members of NATO. They had done a lot, and they were certainly ready for the membership action plan. The interesting thing in Ukraine was that you had a prime minister who was saying, we don't need it. We want the EU. That was Tymoshenko, but we don't want NATO. And you had a president who was saying, we do want it. So you didn't have you didn't have a unified country. And it was a big step for us, especially because of how threatening Putin was being about it. And you remember he came and made some very explosive statements. And so...
You mean that was the first time when he told George W. Bush that if Ukraine joins NATO, it will go there without Crimea and the East?
No. There was no discussion about any of that in 2008, but he was violently opposed to even membership action plan for Georgia and Ukraine. You know, by the time he comes to power, if you're thinking about Soviet mentality, the Baltic states are already well cemented with NATO. But he had this obsession with not losing pieces that he considered belonged to Moscow on his watch. So again, as you go into this summit, you have some allies who are not ready. The Germans were unsure what they wanted. The French were also unsure. And you had the Ukrainians split. So I think if the Ukrainians had been more united at that time, if we had more conversation with them ahead of time, it might have changed. But it was easier to make this compromise decision when you had a Ukraine that hadn't quite decided who it wanted to be at that time.
Was there the possibility of some other scenario?
I mean, membership action plan wouldn't have changed in practical terms much, in the sense that Ukraine was already getting plenty of support and cooperation with NATO. The Ukraine, as you remember, deployed with the NATO-based mission in Afghanistan. They helped with training in other parts of the world. I just think in 2008, there was still a split in the Ukrainian body politic about where they wanted to take their country. They certainly wanted to be part of the EU, but it was sort of a 50-50 poll. In fact, you can blame Putin for how aggressively Ukraine now wants to be European and wants to be free, because support for NATO in Ukraine does not solidify until Crimea is stolen and the little green men show up in the Donbass. So you could argue that Putin drove them into our arms because they wanted and needed protection.
Winter 2014, the moment that made you a star of Russian propaganda, and the meme cookies from the State Department is still being used by Russians. It has become the part of Russian popular culture.
First of all, there were sandwiches. Let's just be clear.
Yes. Let's go there. Not cookies, but sandwiches. Do you regret that was some kind of, I don't know, or on the contrary, do you think that was a good PR, bad PR? What are your emotions about that little episode and such disproportionate consequences for the propaganda?
Look, I was an assistant secretary of state. I was a nobody. I was a Mielich, right? And the fact that Putin was so threatened by all of this that he actually made me a star, just, I thought, spoke massively to Russia's own, Putin and his team's own insecurity about losing Ukraine and about not only the money that they were siphoning off of Ukraine, because, they have huge business interests and they were ripping it off, but the fact that Putin had managed in all those years to maintain political control over the body politic, and that if they lost that, what it meant to him. Because Ukraine was not interested in anything outside Ukraine. They were interested in a more free and less corrupt Ukraine. And that's only a threat to Russia if a cleaner, less corrupt Russia, the way Putin is running it, is a threat to his leadership. So I thought it was sort of a bizarre act of desperation. And just to remember that, all the Western leaders and the younger folk were visiting both the government, the opposition, and the folks on the Maidan at that period. The day that we delivered the sandwiches was right after the night when the Berkut security police, with Putin's encouragement and on Yanukovych's orders, surrounded the folks on the square, and they didn't fire on them, but they started squeezing in on them. And these were 18, 19-year-old Ukrainians who were being ordered to move against their own people. So it had been a very difficult and violent night. So, my instinct was maybe there's too much Slavic culture in my instinct here, but people have suffered, and therefore you shouldn't go empty-handed to see them the next day. So that was how we took the sandwiches. But we also gave them to the Berkut. There's a picture of me giving sandwiches to the Berkut. So it was just, you've all had a rough night. Let's work on this together. It wasn't, United States is directing Ukraine. It was Ukrainians directing Ukraine. So, but the fact that they had to make such a big deal out of it, and the phone call too, was just, so.
But after that, we have that image of the United States organizing as they call it, a coup in Ukraine, and then there is Crimea occupation. Then Russian troops invade the
Crimean theft. Let's call it what it is. The theft of Crimea by Russia.
Then Russian troops come to Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and we see that the negotiations start, and the United States are not involved. Somehow all the process were with France and Germany and Belarus somehow. Lukashenko as a mediator sounds like a joke, but why Americans were not a part of that crucial negotiation?
So I was thinking about that the last couple of days, Misha, because the origin of the European negotiating lead happened at D-Day. We were at Normandy with President Obama, Angela Merkel, must have been Hollande, I guess. And the leaders were between events and having a sort of a lunch. And President Obama's view at that time was, this is a European crisis. Europe should lead in its solution. And I remember watching him walk up to the other two leaders and say, this needs some negotiating. Are you guys ready to lead? And they said, sure. And, that didn't work out so well. But as you remember, by 2015, both the European side and the Russian and Ukrainians were all stuck, and the thing wasn't moving at all. And there was a danger of a frozen conflict, which, is what ultimately happened before it became a hot war again. And both the Russian side and the Ukrainian side asked us to get more involved. And so I had been, as Assistant Secretary, working with the Foreign Ministry, but in a particular meeting that I was in with Kerry, with Putin, Kerry offered that we could become more directly involved, but that we needed somebody empowered by him to talk to, which is when Putin appointed Vyacheslav Surkov to work directly with me, and I did 7 rounds of negotiation, late 15, early 16, with him to see if we could negotiate a Russian withdrawal in exchange for a lot of political and economic autonomy for Donetsk and Luhansk. And we actually did okay in terms of the way the negotiation was structured. We were quite close. I would talk to him, then I would work with the Ukrainians, then I would work with the Europeans, and we'd try to reinforce what the Europeans were doing. But then it became clear that in 2016, Putin would wait and see who got elected in the United States before he would actually cut a deal. And we all know how that turned out. So,
what do you think about Surkov? Because he's such a symbolic and controversial figure in Russian history.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to vouch for what he's said about Russia one way or the other. It was interesting when
you worked personally with him, so
I worked very, very closely with him.
You have some personal emotions.
I worked very, very closely with him. We got to know each other very well. I do think that if Hillary had been elected, and if we had had more time, and if Putin had empowered him, it is possible that we might have been able to cut a deal, but only if Putin had been willing to actually withdraw from Ukraine. But when I first started working with him, he had never negotiated with foreigners before. He'd certainly never negotiated with a woman before. It was interesting. We had a journey together that might have gone somewhere, but the politics got in the way, and maybe Putin never intended to get out. Maybe it was just a way of taptаться na место, sort of treading water to wait and see.
And speaking about another negotiation process, Istanbul, 2022.
This is another Russian myth. Good grief.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
an urban legend. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where is the legend? What was true? Because there was a story first told by former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett that both sides were really close to the end, to the successful end of the negotiations, and then Prime Minister Boris Johnson interfered and stopped prevented Ukrainians from signing the deal. And then Ukrainian Representative Arahami kind of confirmed it, that yes, he said in an interview that there was some kind of advice from Boris Johnson to stop negotiating and to win this war militarily. Where is the myth? Where is the truth?
Well, look, I mean, only the negotiators know for sure because they were the ones in the room. But remember where we were. I think it was late March, early April, right, of 22. So Putin's dream that Kyiv would fall in 5 days, that he'd have control, was clearly not going to happen, and the Russian military was heavily bogged down and doing really stupid things like, 40 miles of open convoy and all of that kind of stuff. And they were starting to get pushed out of the north, et cetera, and it wasn't clear, how much he could hold. So Russia had an interest at that time in at least seeing what it could get. Ukraine obviously had an interest if they could stop the war and get Russia out. So this was something that was worked up. The Turks offered a venue. We were not in the room. We were actually not very much aware of what any kind of deal was. We just sort of said, look, we're here to support. If you want us to know more, know less, we're here. And we never were completely sure how empowered either negotiating team was, whether Putin really was ready to sign on to what his team had agreed to, and whether Zelensky was either. But relatively late in the game, the Ukrainians began asking for advice on where this thing was going. And it became clear to us, clear to the Brits, clear to others, that Putin's main condition was buried in an annex to this document that they were working on. Mm-hmm. And it included limits on the precise kinds of weapons systems that Ukraine could have after the deal, such that Ukraine would basically be neutered as a military force. And there were no similar constraints on Russia. Russia wasn't required to pull back. Russia wasn't required to have a buffer zone from the Ukrainian border, wasn't required to have the same constraints on its military facing Ukraine. And so people inside Ukraine and people outside Ukraine started asking questions about whether this was a good deal, and it was at that point that it fell apart. But I think that plenty of people, and perhaps Zelensky himself, were very suspicious that they were about to fall into a trap. And if Putin could have gotten that, completely neutered, demilitarized Ukraine for nothing, why wouldn't he take it,
Were you surprised with the first days of the war? Because there is the famous quote, we need ammunition, not right, that...
We need ammunition, not...
ammunition, not a ride. That's supposedly
I see.
Zelensky told to President Biden. Yeah. Was it a surprise for you that the Ukrainian resistance was so effective and the Ukrainians were so brave, and Zelensky did not plan to go to Lviv or to anywhere?
Well, first, as you remember, we first discovered the Russian military plan at the end of October of 21. And it was so massive and comprehensive that when we first started briefing the Ukrainians and everybody else and talking to Moscow about what we thought they were going to do, people didn't believe it. It was sort of incomprehensible that he would put 100,000 troops on the three sides of Ukraine. And then we steadily saw the plan implemented through December, January, and early February, that all of this stuff started to move. And we were really counseling the Ukrainians to take stronger defensive measures and to prepare their population that Putin might actually do this.
And Ukrainians didn't believe.
I think they'll all tell their own stories when, God help us, this awful chapter is over and they're truly free again. Some Ukrainians say that they didn't want to spook the population. Mm-hmm. Some Ukrainians say that they were making quiet preparation, but trying to do it in a low-key way. Some Ukrainians think that they could have been even more prepared. But I think a lot of us worried that with the amount of heavy metal that Russia was amassing on three sides, its cyber capabilities, its electromagnetic weapons, and all these kinds of things, the fact that the Ukrainians had very little air defense, even then, especially then, that Kyiv could fall in a matter of weeks. So it was enormously inspiring to see their bravery. But it also, and the fact that in every little village they fought, and that they were actually more prepared. I mean, if Russia had been able to get and hold Hostomel Airport, it might have been totally different, but Ukraine didn't allow that. But it was also really interesting to see how bad the Russian military was. I mean, in the United States, it really completely dispelled this myth of this massive superpower military that could roll across Europe anytime it felt like it. Just the strategy, the tactics, the hubris, the lack of coordination. That was interesting too.
And you didn't expect that?
No.
Mm-hmm. So you overestimated the military might.
What 100,000 Russian troops would be able to do. Yeah.
There is a popular opinion among Russians, especially among Russian diaspora outside of Russia, that in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the West showed real support, moral support, and military support to Ukraine, but forgot about potential allies in Russia, and forgot to create any kind of strategy to attract all those Russians who were shocked by the beginning of the war. Specifically, I'm not speaking about oligarchs, but actually oligarchs are
normal people.
Important because they are Russian elite.
Yeah.
But and obviously there was no strategy to try to divide Putin's elite, to try to convince, to seduce some of them to defect, to go to the West. And speaking about middle class, normal people, they were facing, while leaving Russia, they were facing a lot of difficulties, and probably that was not the part of the strategy. That was probably lack of a strategy. What do you think of that? And for example, personal sanctions against Oleg Tinkov, the person who spoke out against war and lost his bank, lost everything, but he was still sanctioned by the United Kingdom.
I'm not going to speak to the United Kingdom's choices. Yeah, look, I think there were a couple of things here. The initial intense sanctions on the Russian oligarchic class, particularly those who protected and hide Putin's money, protect his family, all of that kind of thing, but also the larger group of rich Russians, very, very rich, who benefit from Putin's patronage and from the system. The decision to sanction them was very much designed to make them question whether this war was good for them, and to make them, encourage them to put pressure on Putin that this wasn't worth it, that he should be focusing instead on Russia and its wealth and its global position, not on his obsession with this piece of property to the south that was not a threat to Russia. But that failed, and it failed because of the complete control and fear and compromise that Putin has on all of those people. And I talked to a lot of them at that time about why they didn't stand up for their own interests, which were not in Ukraine. They were in a strong and economically prosperous and globally integrated Russia. But they were afraid. They were afraid because his control was so complete. And I would argue the same about the Russian media. We did do a lot of Russian media at the time. My own interviews and other interviews were spliced and diced by Russian official media. And, you've got the greatest reach there is by opposition inside of Russia. Misha, you've got, and what is it? At best count, it's about 10 million in a country of 140 million. And so,
that's almost 10%.
Right, which is why we come see you and we try to talk to the Russian people with you. But in the face of the internal machine that Putin had put on his own people and created this massive sense of ownership and justification and nationalism and greatness around first Crimea in 2014 and then Ukraine, all of Ukraine, and created a sense of threat. I don't know that even a massive U.S. or Western program to try to reach more Russians would have made much of a difference. Where I do agree with you is I think we should have given, I still think we should give, more support to Russians who have chosen to leave and who have chosen to make their views known by, at great risk to everything that they built inside Russia. And I do think that we should be working with and talking with those people about what a more open, democratic Russia could look like for their children, for Russia itself. But, every time we get a chance, and the president has done this, and all of us have done this, we try to bring to Russian kitchen tables some of the awful truths of this war, not just for Ukraine, but for Russia that Putin is trying to hide. 1,000 Russian young men a day thrown into the meat grinders of Avdiivka, some of these other tiny little towns, and by some estimates, 200,000 Russian dead, 500,000 Russian dead or wounded. What does that get you? What does that get you? And the inability to travel, the inability to cooperate in science and in economy and in anything having to do with the future. Putin has slammed closed the doors of Russia. He's created the Iron Curtain, recreated it himself for average Russians. And it is sad, particularly for those of us who do believe that, given your rich history and country, we should do things together. We should make this planet better together.
Yeah, that's true. But unfortunately, you probably know that unfortunately for many people who stay in Russia, they sincerely think that this time the Iron Curtain was not created by the Russian authorities, but it was erected by the West, and
that's his propaganda. That's what he tells them.
They were expecting him to close the borders, and he didn't do that because in the beginning, a lot of Russians were really scared of exit visas as they existed in the Soviet Union.
And why didn't he close the borders? Because he's afraid of a revolt among his own people. Why doesn't he do universal conscription? Because he knows that if he starts sending the boys of Moscow and St. Petersburg to Kyiv, that the country will revolt under him. He's afraid of his own people, and he's afraid that fundamentally, if they truly understood that he's spending 25% of the wealth of the nation on this crazy imperial dream of his own, that he wants to be Peter the Great, and he wants to be Peter the Great and Catherine in territorial terms.
Ivan the Terrible, yeah.
Ivan the Terrible. Rather than being a guy after 5 terms who leaves a legacy of greatness in terms of economic muscle, in terms of science, in terms of technology, all of those things. And he's stealing the future from you and your kids. He's made a massive mistake, and instead of fixing it, he could end this war tomorrow. Everything would change.
Now he loves the war. Now he embraced the war, and he loves it so much that he doesn't see any.
Because it's not affecting him. His sons aren't going.
It helps him. It helps him to control the country. It makes so many people so much more afraid.
Of course. It allows him to perpetuate not only the suffering in Ukraine, but this autocratic domination of individual Russian life and future that he has instituted and that he has stolen from your people.
I've got my last question. My last question about the future. Now you are not working for the State Department, so I can ask that. You know that Putin is dreaming, and he has stated that in many speeches, that actually his real dream is New Yalta. He wants to repeat that scenario. He wants to get together with American president and Chinese chairman and to sign the new treaty about the new world order and to divide the world. literally, as people in 19th, as leaders in 19th century did, as happened in Yalta in 1945. And he believes that if Donald Trump is elected, that would be possible. Do you think that that the next American administration, Trump administration, is hypothetically capable to have that kind of a deal with Putin?
Well, first of all, Putin needs to wake up. It's not the 18th century, it's not the 19th century, it's not even the 20th century. By all accounts, Yalta was not a good deal for us and not a deal that we should have cut. And it resulted in 70 years of Cold War. Why was that a good idea? And these massive nuclear arsenals facing each other when we had been allies in that war. It made no sense, right? It created a bad, unstable world. Any similar effort by great powers to divide the world and to tell the smaller countries what they can or can't do is going to be equally unstable, including for Russia. So it's not going to work. But more importantly, whatever Donald Trump may or may not believe, the American people hate a bully. And they hate an aggressor, and they always have. That's what we are born of, a perception that in those days, Great Britain was trying to bully us, right? And what we have stood for all of these years is the sovereignty and self-determination of nations. And so whatever Trump may want to do, I don't think the American people will let him abandon Ukraine. I think you see that in this vote for the $60 billion that finally happened in April. Trump was against that money, and he fought against it and tried to bully Republicans in the Congress. But they were listening to the American heartland that said that we don't want to live in a world where a big guy gets to eat a little country just because he wants to, because that's going to have implications for us, and it's going to end up with us in a war of great powers that we don't want. So we'd have to stop this here and roll it back here. And that's why so many Republicans said no to Trump and voted for the money. It's the first time that Trump actually lost in the U.S. Congress. And it wasn't because Biden was president, it was because his Republicans didn't agree with him. And I think even if he's elected, and I hope that the American people are smarter than that, but who knows, he will not be able to abandon Ukraine. And because the American people don't want to live in a world where bullies like Putin can do what they want. And the implications that has in Asia and with Iran and everything else are not safe for us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Misha.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.